Good afternoon. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this workshop, we bring in scholars from across the country to present their research and to engage in a discussion with the NDSU community. Today, we have a virtual presentation. I'm really excited that we're joined by Dr. Carol Graham from the Brookings Institution and from the University of Maryland. So Dr. Carol Graham is a Leo Pavlovsky Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, College Park Professor at the University of Maryland, and a Senior Scientist at Gallup. Her research areas include well-being and happiness, poverty, inequality, and public health. She is the author of numerous books, most recently, Happiness for All, Unequal Hopes and Lives in Pursuit of the American Dream, The Pursuit of Happiness, an Economy of Well-Being and Happiness Around the World, The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires. Born in Lima, Peru, she received her PhD from Oxford University with a concentration in economic development, political economy, and Latin America. And we are really excited about Carol presenting today, and there will be a chance for you to ask your own questions of Carol after the presentation. Dr. Clay Rutledge will serve as a moderator of those questions. So please submit your questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom during Carol's presentation. And without any further delay, I'd like to welcome Dr. Carol Graham and thank you for coming today. We're really excited about your presentation. So welcome, Carol.
Thank you, John, for the invite. And I wish I was in snowy North Dakota right now, but I'm in quite sunny. I'm on the Chesapeake Bay near Washington, D.C., where I work, and I think it's going to be 65 degrees. I did not make my travel decisions based on the weather, but I seem to have lucked out. Anyway, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. I'm just going to quickly share my screen so that, okay, that should work. Okay, perfect. So anyway, as John mentioned, I work on happiness, well-being, public health issues. I spent most of my career working on poverty and inequality and also the well-being of poor people in very poor places. But most recently, I've been focusing on the United States, and rather than happiness, I've been unfortunately focusing on despair and then deaths of despair. So it's been a shift for me. I grew up between Peru and Baltimore. My dad was at Johns Hopkins, and we lived in Peru. But all of my early life, we would come to the United States, and it was sort of the star of democracy, the star of good economies and good health, and we came from, or we lived in at least half the year a much poorer country, with what seemed many more insolvable problems. But over time, I realized that there was something going on in the United States that wasn't right, so to speak. There was something very depressing about the nature of poverty. Inequality didn't seem to enter the political debate, although it was very clear that our distributional changes were large, and they didn't just apply to income inequality, but they also applied to opportunities. And I'm sure many of you know that now the chances or the odds of a child born in the bottom 50th percent of the distribution are much lower to end up in the highest distribution than they were 50 years ago. So our social mobility rates have also gone way down, and it was our exceptional opportunity and mobility that made the U.S., or that gave the U.S. the kind of land of opportunity, the sort of myth or the reputation as the land of opportunity. That's why people migrate here. That's why people who could come very poor could end up doing very well. But that's changed, not completely, but to some extent. And in thinking about all this and wondering why this is about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I thought maybe if I tell the story of inequality and opportunity in the United States from the perspective of divisions in well-being and in belief in the future and belief in hard work, rather than just the the metrics that are often used to measure inequality and opportunity are not very understandable to the average person. I mean, how many of you know the Teal statistic or the Gini coefficient or the 90-10 ratio? Versus if you tell people that hope is more unequally distributed in the United States than in Latin America. So the differences in hope for the future across the rich and the poor are much, much greater in the United States than they are in Latin America, a region known for its poverty and inequality. And stress is also unequally distributed. The poor in the US not only experience much more stress on a daily basis than do the rich, but they experience much more stress on a daily basis than do the poor in Latin America. Again, sort of a surprising finding. And the last thing is it seems like a silly marker, but with a measure of smiling yesterday, which is basically an assessment of people's moods as they go through their daily life. I don't work a lot with it. It's not one of the more serious statistics, but it does capture sort of moods and how you're going through your day. The poor in the US smile significantly less on a daily basis than do the poor in Latin America. So what I was observing and sensing turned out to show up very starkly in the metrics. And when I found this, I decided to look across races in the US, and I divided into the biggest race groups we had in our data. So it was poor or low-income Blacks, low-income whites, and low-income Hispanics. And I expected Hispanics to score quite highly. It tends to be, there's sort of a cultural cheerfulness that Hispanics both in the US and in Latin America have. I expected poor African Americans to do poorly because this was the time of the first big police riots in about 2015. We had the Ferguson riots in Missouri. We had the Baltimore riots in Baltimore, very, very close to where I am. And I thought poor African Americans would not be hopeful for the future. And then we had poor whites, who I thought would be somewhere in the middle. And instead, I got a very, very different finding. And what I got was essentially that poor African Americans were 3 times as likely to be higher up on our optimism scale than were poor whites. And this really surprised me. Hispanics were a little bit behind poor Blacks, but also more optimistic than low-income whites. And I started exploring what could possibly be going on, including could it be a coding error in my data? Well, it turned out it was not. It was a very persistent finding. It's held for years, and it's been there for years before, and it's held through the Trump election. It held through it's held through COVID. It held through the George Floyd riots. So what is it? I'll explain more as we go through, but it seemed a puzzle. And then my colleagues at Princeton, Ann Case and Angus Deaton, released the first paper showing what we now know as deaths of despair. These are premature deaths among less than college educated middle-aged whites due to alcohol, drug overdose, and suicide. And this was a huge, surprising thing. It shook a lot of us up that work in the public health space because it was a very unknown finding. And yet, it's a phenomenon that's grown tremendously. We lose approximately, prior to COVID, we were losing about 70,000 people to deaths of despair each year from about 2005 until 2019. COVID, because of the excess shock on COVID, we're at about 100,000 deaths. These are not COVID deaths. These are people taking their own lives or committing slow suicide or overdosing on drugs. And it's primarily a white phenomenon, but we are seeing some creep, particularly in 2019 and 2020, into minorities and to younger ages. So it's a very worrisome finding. So with that as a background, I decided to see if our metrics of well-being, ill-being, life satisfaction, optimism for the future, stress and worry yesterday actually match the patterns in deaths of despair. And so let me show you what I've found and also what that implies policy-wise and what we can do with these metrics as a tracking tool, as a way to measure, take society's temperature, so to speak. Just to go back quickly, if working on happiness can be challenging, I get a lot of media calls saying, are you a happy person? And I have to say, I hate to disappoint you, but I'm not studying if I'm a happy person, or telling people how to be happy. We have, hundreds and thousands and even millions of respondents in the Gallup data around the world and in the United States. And we have a robust measurement science where we can see not only the determinants of well-being, which includes happiness but goes well beyond it, but also what well-being causes, right? This is quite a technical science. It's as an economist, I work primarily with economic metrics and in the economic space, but it's a cross-disciplinary science now, and it includes biologists and geneticists, certainly psychologists. And we're starting to try and get a better grasp of the determinants of human well-being, but also, and I think more importantly, what it causes. So when you think about Jefferson's famous pursuit of happiness, he was not, I've read quite a bit about what he was thinking as he wrote this, and he was not talking about contentment. He was talking about opportunities to seek fulfilling lives. It was a concept that combines individual freedom and at the same time social fairness. Without social fairness, you're not going to have a society where there is equal opportunity. And so the pursuit of happiness was very much about opportunity, but also freedom of choice, being able to live the life you want to lead, and not just the life you can lead, which for some people is not a very good life, but trying to give as many citizens as possible that opportunity to lead a productive and fulfilling life. And so my research has been exploring why the increasingly unequal distributions of income, of well-being, and of opportunity all matter. And they're actually equally important to our future health and prosperity than they are today. So, for example, more optimistic people live longer and they're more productive. We find for sure that employees with higher levels of life satisfaction, more autonomy, more meaning and purpose are much more productive, much more likely to be healthy. And I think the business sector has really caught on to this as something that is not just necessarily good for the employees, but good for the firm as a whole. So this isn't, it's a science and approach that's very appealing across many, not just many disciplines, but also in terms of not just the public sector space. It's obviously of interest to public health people, but it's also of interest and relevance to our prosperity as a country. As I mentioned, I'm focusing on inequality and well-being and the deaths of despair. And what we found showing that these metrics match so closely with the patterns in deaths of despair at the level of individuals, at the level of race, and the level of place. We've been measuring the deaths at the county level, CDC data for these kinds of deaths, and the Gallup data also at the county level on hope for the future, life satisfaction today, stress and worry yesterday. And we not only have found that they match robustly, but we also have a later paper where we showed that optimism began to fall in the United States in the late 1970s, primarily among less than college educated white men, at the same time that optimism began to increase for African Americans and for women because rights changed in that time. So that optimism fell for men, especially high school only educated men, because the first wave of manufacturing took away a lot of jobs and shook up a lot of confidence in sort of what was going to go on next in the manufacturing arena. And as we know, both mining and manufacturing from then on had very big hits and several waves of decline. Some was due to a dot-com shock, some was due to the China shock. But the fate of blue-collar working-class men and Black working-class men, but it's a whole other topic in terms of differential levels of resilience, but the fate of blue-collar white men changed very much. And the deaths of despair began about 20 years after that first wave of declines in optimism. So it's very clear, we have other data that show that these metrics can serve as warning indicators before we have, for example, a full-blown crisis of mortality. It's very cheap to measure well-being. We know that hope causes better outcomes. We're also very well aware that despair leads to much worse outcomes. And in our case, in this extreme example of what we call deaths of despair. And then already, we were in the midst of all this when COVID hit. And COVID certainly has posed many challenges, economic shocks, uncertainty, health, a health crisis, but also has hit some of the most vulnerable people, the people who were already disadvantaged and or very vulnerable to opioid addiction, have suffered a great deal. And I'll show you our estimates of mortality in a bit on that. But let me just say very quickly a couple words about how we measure this. I'm not sure too many people want to see equations, but I will keep it simple, and I think you'll see why it matters. Just have a look at this very quickly. The most important thing to remember is the last bullet on this slide, the italicized bullet that says we are not asking people if certain things make them happy, like does smoking make you unhappy or does marriage make you happy? What we do is we have, as I said, these large N data sets, millions of people around the world, several million people in the US over time. For a while, we had daily data on the United States from Gallup, which was amazing. 1,000 people a day from the financial crisis through 2019. So we really cover a lot of ground. But in any event, what we do is we have these equations where we measure the WIT is the well-being of individual I at time T. So well-being could be how satisfied are you with your life? How satisfied with your life will you be in 10 years, which is an optimism question. It could be, did you worry frequently yesterday? Yes or no? Could be, were you angry frequently yesterday? It could be, do you have, on a scale of 0 to 10, the same life satisfaction scale we use, how much do you have meaning and purpose in your life? Where would you place yourself? And that turns out to be a really important measure of people's ability to lead fulfilling lives. So then we have a constant term, and then we have a vector, which is a kind of a whole list of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, people's age, their gender, their marital status, their employment status, their education, their health status, and much, much more. And then we have the epsilon IT is an error term, and most econometric equations just toss away the error term as noise in the data that you can't measure or observe. But it turns out that well-being is in part biological, in part genetic, and innate traits. We can measure about 30 to 40% of people's reported well-being with what we can observe, what's in that equation. But almost, over half of it is actually unobservable. It's innate personality traits. And so that error term tells you a lot, because people who are happier than the average will have a higher error term in terms of a positive, unexplained happiness, and people who are more negative than the average will have a negative one. And that matters. What we found is that I wrote the first paper on what does happiness cause, and we found that this unexplained error term, which we, were able to collect in a first stage equation, later, 5 years later, was very strongly associated with better future outcomes, suggesting that, it's this residual happiness, the innate part of happiness, also matters to how people navigate their lives, how resilient they are, how not just resilient to negative shocks, but also to adversity, and there's an interaction, as in the case of do genes or the environment determine IQ? In this case, you have people with higher innate levels of well-being also interact with their environment, and that interaction changes over time, and it can result in better outcomes over time, or it can result in worse outcomes over time. In the same way that with genes in the environment, everybody's endowed with a certain genetic pool, but that pool interacts with how the environment that they end up being born in, the challenges they face, or the advantages they face. And in the end, all of that contributes to IQ. Very similar. So having these large N equations, we can then explore the happiness effects of things that vary or change more, such as inflation, unemployment rates, inequality, environmental quality, commuting time, smoking, exercise, all sorts of things. There's a whole range of things we can explore that standard economic approaches, such as basing, everything is based on observed consumption choices, don't always answer very well. I mean, if for smokers are significantly less happy than non-smokers, for example, but if smokers are purchasing cigarettes as a revealed preference and an optimal rational choice in the way that standard economics assume, why are they less happy, right? So we're able to observe behaviors that are not driven by optimal consumption choices within a fixed budget constraint, but that are often driven by addiction, norms, self-control problems. Strong norms of discrimination, for example, may make people have low expectations due to their experience over time, and then they may not respond to economic incentives the way we think they would. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, people with higher levels of well-being and hope for the future are more productive and they live longer. So to one more slide. Now this slide will make you happy or unhappy depending on your age. As you can see, this is a look at happiness and years of age. This data happens to be from Latin America, but we found this pattern holds around the world. There's a U curve in happiness or life satisfaction, which falls in about the middle-age years, somewhere between 40 and 55 years, sometimes 60 in countries or people that are very unhappy. They get out of it and turn later. But indeed, there is kind of a midlife dip in well-being. Why is it? It's complicated, but it holds across millions and millions of people around the world in countries all over the world. What we find is that, at some level, it's quite obvious. Expectations have to align with reality. And if by the time you're 47, as in this chart, and you can't play guitar or sing, you probably should give up on being a rock star. It's just kind of, that can be hard. But over time, you get over that and keep going. There's also what often double financial burdens or double time burdens. People really underestimate the effect of time use or lack of time on people's well-being. And people in the middle-aged years often have teenage kids, older parents, a lot of demands, not just on their time, but also financial burdens. Then psychologists and psychiatrists talk about something called emotional wisdom, that younger people have more emotional swings, more extreme ones, they're very happy or very unhappy. And that as people get older, their emotions get much more stable and they become emotionally more wise. I also think about it that by the time we get older, you just become much more resilient to negative shocks because you've had so many, they just roll off your back. Versus when you're young, a negative shock seems like the end of the world. So anyway, there's also a genetic component to this. My colleague, Andrew Oswald in the UK, did a study on and found a U curve in apes using, I'm not kidding here. They used their smiles, or the way chimpanzees smile, as measures of their cheerfulness. And they found that they smiled much less in middle-aged ape years than they did in the beginning and at the end. And this paper was published in Science. It's a very good paper and involved all kinds of, neuroscientists and animal scientists and everything else. But the point is, some of this is just biological. So why do people get happier as they age? Because as anybody who's gotten a bit older knows, aging has all kinds of challenges that aren't so nice, right? You can't run as fast, you get injured more easily, whatever. Well, it turns out that part of it is this emotional wisdom. Part of it is a sort of an appreciation for life. You sort of don't have to fight every battle as much, typically. There's also, again, this is controlling for being in good health, age-adjusted health. So we're not expecting a 75-year-old to look like an 18-year-old health-wise, but in reasonable health for 75 years, controlling for health and controlling for having some sort of partnership. And it turns out also income matters a bit, not as much as you would think, because this holds across people everywhere. But in places where it's very violent or very awful to age because, it's deep poverty or a lot of violence, or really terrible health care, we don't find that this curve holds as strongly. And lastly, there's a selection bias. So happier people, as I mentioned, live much longer. So as you go up that age curve, you're finding the sample of people who live to, 80, 85, 90 are much smaller. And the happier people live longer, while the unhappy people have been were more likely to die off. So you get a bias that way as well. But back to the despair point, this low point in Middle Ages is exactly where we saw the deaths of despair surface, and they are still more prominent. It's between sort of 35 and 60 years. So it's already an age where there are challenges to well-being. And then it turns out that a lot of people in this cohort of primarily less than college educated whites, both men and women, but now some others, now some minorities, are not coming out of the U. They're essentially ending their own lives due to despair before they get older. And if you, I'm going to come back to that slide. So here is this mortality rise in the United States. This is a 2015 slide. It's the same now. It really hasn't changed. If you look at that red line, that's U.S. whites, non-Hispanic whites, and these others are rich country: France, Germany, UK, Canada, Australia, Sweden. You see that our mortality rate is the only one going up rather than down, starting in about 2005, when the deaths of despair started. If you look in the middle of the chart, there's a thick blue line and it says USH. That's US Hispanics. So interestingly enough, they started from a lower lower life expectancy level, but yet they continue to improve along with the European countries versus US whites really depart from the line. And if we had African Americans on this line, they would, like US Hispanics, be gradually going down along with the wealthy countries. And as I said, these are a large number of deaths every year, enough to drive up our overall mortality rate and drive down our life expectancy rate by a year or two over that decade, which is that's a big effect for one cohort to make. As I mentioned, these markers are very different in terms of whites and minorities. And here are my findings that I discussed early on about optimism levels being very different across races. So these are all the low-income groups that we measured in this exercise. And as you can see, African Americans are almost 3 times as higher on our 0 to 10 optimism scale than their odds of being on a higher rung, or about 3 times higher than our poor whites, the left out group, higher than Hispanics. They do all right. And then really most groups, all groups on this slide, are actually higher than low-income whites. And again, you see that in a very graphic way with this deaths of despair chart. So what more do we know? What can we do about it is a very big question. Again, I mentioned that we've been tracking these deaths of despair at the MSA level and county level using the death rates and then our metrics of well-being and ill-being. And what we found is that optimism was the most important marker associated with lower levels of deaths of despair. And despair was obviously the worst in terms of higher levels of deaths of despair. Stress also worked that way. We also found a place effect, right? So if you think about it, if you live in a declining community where firms are closing and a lot of people are dying of this kind of deaths, it's probably pretty hard to stay optimistic. And it may be that causality is both ways, that at one level, the environment may cause people to have more despair, but living with more people in despair may also add to despair and to premature mortality. Again, I mentioned that we found that this is an overtime finding, and that drops in optimism in the same cohort started way, way before the death rates increased. We also looked at the role of place and health behaviors such as smoking and exercising. And indeed, it turns out that places with higher levels of well-being and lower premature mortality rates have healthier behaviors across the board. More people exercise and less people smoke. And also places with more racial diversity tend to have lower levels of deaths of despair. Some of that is an artifact of construction. If we know that Blacks and Hispanics are already more optimistic, well, you aggregate that up at the level of place, and that's going to show up in the data. But it's also that more diverse places tend to have more vibrant economies. They tend to be more likely to be on the coast with a whole range of different economic activities, versus we find that despair deaths are not only, but disproportionately concentrated in blue-collar white communities in former mining and manufacturing parts of the country. So where one firm closes down and they're just, there's not much else. And even the smaller things like restaurants or barbershops or whatever that were supporting that community, they shut down when the firms go away, right? And it's in these same communities where we find a high level of prime age males out of the labor force and high levels of opioid addiction. And as I mentioned, we've been tracking this stuff. We've now been adding in COVID deaths and seeing where there's a coincidence of these two public health crises, deaths of despair and COVID. And the results are pretty stark. I'll show you those in a second. Finally, we have an interactive indicator on our website where you can actually explore difference in patterns in optimism and stress among minorities and whites, and in states in the country, and then at the county level in the country. And you can even see huge differences in counties on these markers within the same state. And the link to it is down there. So one of the things that's also accompanied despair is these very high levels of labor force dropout. Depending on when you measure it, we have about 20% of prime age men out of the labor force in our country. So this is men who are range from 25 to 54 and have not they've simply dropped out of the labor force. So we can, prior to COVID, we were saying we had record low levels of unemployment, yet we had 25% of prime age workers out of the labor force. Well, why is that? Well, the unemployment rate only includes people in its ratio that have looked for a job in the past 6 months. So if you've dropped out of the labor force, you're forgotten by the standard statistics. It can be in the media that our labor force is a wonderful 4%, and yet there are people in despair that are so desperate they've just given up. And in a recent article we did in Social Science and Medicine, we looked at in more detail at the despair and the health status of these workers out of the labor force. Again, we found that the white prime age males did worse when they were out of the labor force than minorities, who are used to having just a wider range of jobs, not as likely to have stable blue collar jobs, not as likely to have the jobs that have been lost, although they've also suffered. And we found that prime age males out of the labor force have higher levels of despair, worse levels of objective health, much higher levels of reported pain, reported disease diagnostics, and opioid addiction. And again, the whites are worse than the minorities. Prime age women out of the labor force aren't a happy group either, but they tend to have some sort of reason to get up out of bed every morning. They tend to be caregivers, either for young children or older people. The men who've lost their jobs tend to struggle to find another purpose or activity. They tend to live in counties with high levels of deaths of despair. They're much more likely to live in their parents' homes or census tracts than any other labor market group. And when you think about their state, high levels of despair and opioid use and generally low skills, it makes it very unlikely that they're going to move, even if there are economic opportunities in near proximity. A lot of our discussion about our opportunity rates, our geographic mobility going down, assume that people will move to opportunity. These guys are not going to move to opportunity, even if it's across the street. I mean, they have sort of dropped off the map of normal, purposeful existence. And it's a very big problem. Also, one thing I'm going to talk about briefly is that what's happening to children of these cohorts if they have children. And states matter, a place matters. This is a map in a piece we did called the Geography of Desperation, where we show that there's a geographical concentration of this kinds of mortality. But also, if you were to superimpose, the dark red is the most deaths of despair. If you were to superimpose a map of lack of hope, a map of reported pain, Americans report more pain on a daily basis than people in 30 other countries, many less wealthy than we are. And that pain is concentrated in this same cohort, less than college educated whites. Hispanics and Blacks are less likely to report pain. There are a lot of reasons. I'd be happy to answer that in the questions. I should keep moving here. We also find that these same places tend to have civic and cognitive skill deserts, and they tend to be more likely to have radicalized voting. So it's Again, this is not just a public health problem, although it's certainly a big public health problem. It's now becoming a problem that's dividing our country. And this is just an initial estimate we did on estimating what we call excess deaths of despair from COVID. So these aren't COVID deaths. These are increases in opioids or suicides or gun violence deaths due in the COVID period compared to the year before. We did this estimation with first responder data. We have data for 49 states that report these kinds of calls for overdoses, calls for suicides, calls. What we see, and has now been confirmed by the preliminary 2020 data, is a huge increase, a third increase essentially of opioid overdoses in 2020 compared to 2019. We had 70,000 opioid overdoses in 2019, and we had 93,000 in 2020. That doesn't include all the other kinds of despair, right? That's just opioid overdose. We actually see suicide patterns being similar and even falling slightly in 2020, but the increase in overdoses probably is capturing a lot of suicides, right? The one thing first responders, coroners reports, whatever, have a very hard time doing is disentangling intentional from unintentional opioid overdoses, unless you have a note, right? Or you have somebody observed it. And so it's possible that some of the suicides were in the increases in overdose. We also find that, suicides tend to be higher for older men, and a lot of older people died of COVID. So it's very difficult to disentangle everything going on, but clearly there was a shock in terms of COVID, in terms of these deaths of despair. That's just the increase in mental and behavioral calls. Those are calls where people report somebody on their street is acting weirdly or, has the potential to be violent, whatever it might be. Okay, then very quickly, I just wanted to show you when I talked about hope for the future and optimism continuing to be very high for African Americans. These are just low income groups again. And then you see, actually, no, it's low to high. But what you see is the black line is, the blue line is African Americans, the red line is whites, the green line is Hispanics. And you can see there's big gaps on current levels of life satisfaction, again, with African Americans scoring much higher in the midst of COVID. We did this survey 4 waves during COVID, so from April 2020 through February 2021. And if you see life satisfaction 5 years in the future on the right panel, you'll see an even bigger gap between African Americans and the rest. And that gap is particularly big at the low income level, like the initial results I showed you, but those were from 2015. So this optimism has persisted, and it's persistent even though you'll see anxiety rose significantly during the COVID period. This is just reported anxiety from the Census Pulse data. And you can see there's big spikes during particular waves of the pandemic. The dates are in the bottom horizontal line. That's for the whole sample, everybody. And here is for Blacks. You can see their anxiety also spikes during the COVID waves. It also spikes a little bit during the George Floyd era. And at the same time, these increases in anxiety are not leading to complete despair. You're seeing they coexist with reported optimism. So it's a bit of a puzzle, but it also helps explain what's going on in terms of our deaths of despair and some other, the associative factors surrounding that phenomenon. So lastly, I've been doing surveys. I think I just have 5 minutes max left. So I'll go through this quickly, and again, happy to answer more questions about it. Is what I call the long reach of hope, or the long reach of not having hope, and thinking about the next generations. As we know, during COVID, the big increases in reported anxiety and depression have been among the young compared to everybody else. The first time that they're usually higher in the middle age groups. I showed you the U curve. We're seeing a big increase in worry and anxiety among young adults. And we also find we're starting to see some increases in minority teens, educated minority teens. I will try and explain that once I get through this and maybe in the questions. But what we've been doing is taking surveys of low-income adults in Peru, where I started, and then in Missouri, in poor African-American school districts and in poor white school districts. These are high school graduates. And we're exploring their hope for the future, their education aspirations, their past, their negative shocks, their relationships with their parents, their also we ask all kinds of things. Their reports of engaging in risky behaviors, and then we follow them up. And what we found is, again, mirroring the findings on the Black-white optimism, those differentials. We found that even though it's more difficult for African-American kids, these are in deprived communities, to graduate high school, conditional on graduation, they're more likely to pursue college than are the low-income white ones. And the Missouri patterns show up. And we found that lack of hope, low trust, low education aspirations among the white kids compared to the African-American kids. And so these are quite surprising findings. What I found most depressing about these findings was the white kids, they mainly finish high school. Sometimes they aspired to a year of vocational or technical education, but they said their parents did not support them in pursuing higher levels of education. They actively did not support them going to college. Versus the African-American kids tended to have somebody, it could be a grandparent. I'm not saying their lives are perfect, but they had somebody in their household supporting them trying to pursue college, and 99% of them, versus about 1% of the white kids, aspired to go to college. And what we found in the Peru survey, where we were able to repeat and observe these same age respondents 3 years later in the early 20s, they were on track. The high aspiration kids who also had a mentor, and these are poor kids, they were on track. They were in college. They even had aspirations for grad school, some of them. They were much less likely to have engaged in risky behaviors like risky drugs, unsafe sex. And again, their aspirations mattered. They mattered 3 years later. They still had high aspirations. And that's why I talk about the long reach of hope or lack thereof, right? So what we find in some low-income white places is that the despair is almost being passed on to the next generation. Don't go to college. It doesn't do anything for you, right? It's creating a next generation in despair. And what we've been trying to do in terms of developing policy initiatives is to think about, what do low-income white kids or any low-income kids need to survive in tomorrow's labor markets? In tomorrow's labor markets, and even today's, a high school education just doesn't get you anywhere. I mean, it really doesn't, and it's going to be worse. So these kids need not just hope, because hope without agency is also not very useful. They need mentors that can provide them with some sort of information about what kinds of education to invest in. What kind of jobs are they out there for me? It's amazing how little, at least the kids I surveyed, knew about what tomorrow's labor markets would look like. So we're trying to design interventions that can provide hope, but also that provide mentorship that gives kids a reason to have hope. And these are based on interventions to enhance well-being in many places that have tried a lot in the UK, some at the municipal level in the US. But without them, I think we will have a next generation in despair. And so this is very much an open-ended, what we're trying to do, end to this. But the point is, you talk about deaths of despair and this terrible public health crisis in our country. And yet, if we don't do anything, and if we don't have any ideas about what to do about it, it's going to get worse, because labor markets are only going to. One of the things that tomorrow's labor markets require are cognitive and socio-emotional skills, some technical, mid-level programming skills, whatever it is. There's a range of options, but a high school education alone is unlikely to guarantee any kind of stable or decent life in the future. And then finally, one of the things that I think has shaken us up in a sort of extremely negative way, but I think is hopefully will lead to some progress, is that COVID did expose how divided our system is, how there are deep vulnerabilities that are unaddressed, how we have unequal access to healthcare, and in particular mental health care. The amount we spend on mental health care compared to other kinds of health is, about a 10th at most. Maybe it's a 5th. We also found, that this age-old system where your health insurance is tied to your job was a huge shock during COVID, right? Because if you're unemployed and you lose your health insurance at a time that there's a pandemic going on, it's, that's not going to go well, and it didn't. And then in the high toll in terms of deaths and mental health has also highlighted our long-term neglect of societal well-being. We can't have productivity if this much of our society is essentially sick. And one of the things we really pointed to in a task force I led at Brookings and some other related efforts is that we need to deal with this crisis of despair, societal despair, as part of our economic recovery efforts. What we find is that there are good efforts out there to try and enhance economic recovery from the federal level to much lower level local levels. And there's some really potentially inspiring efforts to deal with the mental health and despair crisis, but they don't talk to each other. They don't know about each other. And so they're operating in silos. And I think unless we deal with this as a whole social crisis and think about societal well-being, I don't think we'll get very far. The other thing that seems to be happening, and in part due to our report, is that the federal agencies are finally starting to track well-being metrics, ill-being and well-being. The Fed Shed, CDC, the Census Pulse, they're all including metrics of depression and anxiety. They have a long way to go to get the measurement right, but it's a start. And we're way behind many other countries in the world that already naturally do this. And they just complement their standard economic metrics with metrics of life satisfaction, meaning and purpose, reported stress, reported worry. They're not expensive to collect, and you can have a full battery of data with just adding 4 or 5 questions to say, census data is not collected often enough, but we have a lot of yearly surveys, Health and Human Services, as I mentioned, Federal Reserve Board surveys, all kinds of surveys we have in the United States could be tracking this stuff and serving as warning indicators. We would have been able to measure the well-being impact of the COVID shock if we had official, publicly available official statistics on this, like many countries like the UK, New Zealand, Canada already have, but we don't. So it's all been piecemeal. But as I mentioned, I think the COVID shock has sort of provided at least some interest in this whole issue, largely due to fear of the trends we have going on. When you have opioid overdoses increasing at the rate they are and the number of deaths we have from despair, it is a bit of a wake-up call. And then, the COVID crisis on top of that. So I will stop there, and hopefully there are some questions or comments.
Okay. Thank you, Carol, for sharing your work with us. That was a great presentation. We actually do have a number of questions from the online audience. Some of these I'll just read to you. Some of them I'll combine with some of my own questions. I'm a psychologist, so I'm very fascinated in this topic, and I totally agree with you about the importance of well-being and other future-oriented psychological resilience factors, agency factors. I was curious if you wanted to just comment real briefly at something you hinted at throughout, but understandably didn't necessarily want to get into, about why some groups might be more resilient than others, even if they, might face, similar or even worse current economic conditions. And that could be within the US or also globally. So particularly like minority groups. Right.
And, indeed, having studied I did my dissertation more years ago than I want to admit for Oxford in Peru, and looked at the coping strategies of the very poor during hyperinflation and shining path terrorism. So a really rivetingly horrible time, and was amazed at the resilience and wiseness of the poor in terms of figuring out how to deal with these challenges, everything from whether to put their money in dollars overnight because of the hyperinflation or not. I mean, so all these people knew what the exchange rate was every night. How many people on the street in the US know what our exchange rate is? I mean, what it even means. but it was this psychological resilience that was remarkable. And so when I found this founding for African Americans in the US, I was initially surprised, but then, thinking historically, reading historically, talking to psychologists, sociologists, realized that it was a resilience that had been built up over time. And that, and that having to deal with adversity and having to deal with long-term discrimination, as to immigrants in this country, had contributed to this resilience. But another part of that story is the very different narrative that different racial cohorts have. So in this country, for blue-collar whites in particular, it was the American dream. You work hard, you get ahead. It might not have been glamorous work, but it was stable. It gave you an identity. It gave you a lower middle class existence, kind of the Ozzie and Harriet family. It was the firm, the family, and people believed in doing it themselves, not in government handouts. And this is all very admirable. Versus minorities has had to deal with adversity and somebody in their family falling back forever. And they built something that I call communities of empathy, which have to do this with these long sort of extended ties that provide mentorship. They provide a safety net. And there's a lot about the collective that makes those work. If you think about Baptist churches, they're very communal churches. If you think about Latin American extended families and religious groups, it's as much about music and cooking as, it is about going to church. I'm not trying to demean religion by any means, but I'm just saying there are things about it that have nothing to do with religion that have served as very, very strong coping mechanisms, informal coping mechanisms because we tend to have a very weak safety net. And what happened to this white group that's now in so much despair is that when the jobs were gone, the firms pulled out. There hadn't been a tradition of having to get educated to get out. You did fine in your community. You finished high school. You had privileged access to blue-collar jobs. You worked hard. You were sort of pillars in your community with respect, with a narrative, and that was gone. And then when marriage rates fell with the jobs, the decline in marriage rates in the US has been quite high. What's interesting is rich people still get married and poor people are much less likely to than in the past. So the families fell apart and there weren't these same extended communities. It was just, a different model, a different way of living for decades and decades at work. And for minorities, if the education findings seem surprising, they're not that funny because it's not clear it always worked. There's still a problem with kids fitting into colleges sometimes, particularly like the more competitive the college, sometimes the harder it is for some minorities. But they were told from day one, the only way you're going to get out of this situation is to educate, because they can't take that away from you, right? That's your tool to get ahead. Versus this narrative that, if you finished high school and you worked hard, you would be fine, doesn't work anymore. But I think the male-female difference on this is that women tend to be multitaskers. They have the kids, they tend to take care of the older parents. For the sort of narrative for white blue-collar men was that they were the breadwinners. They were the ones that went to work. And so when those jobs were gone, there wasn't another narrative to fall back on. And there certainly wasn't 2 decades ago any sort of attention to the kind of mental health issues we discuss now, even though we're still not funding them enough. There's much more understanding of even, the role that job displacement has on people, because we've had such high levels of it, because I think the science has advanced. And then, there's a whole other component of this research in terms of the innate traits part I was talking about. There are also genetic differences in terms of certain genes that carry the alleles that carry more serotonin and resilience, and that plays a role. So it's incredibly complex thing to disentangle, but the patterns are very stark and clear.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of touched on this a little, but one of the questions that someone in our virtual audience asked is, have you looked at specific differences on happiness, optimism, deaths of despair, etc., breaking it down between religious and non-religious people in these communities.
Yes. So what I did is I did it in a different way, because we don't have good data on religious affiliation in the Gallup. We have Catholic, Protestant. I was trying to get at evangelicals, but it's sort of it's somewhere in non-Protestant, still Christian religion, but that could include any number of groups. So first of all, I controlled for religion, just if people had thought religion was important in their lives or not. And African Americans had the highest level of that, but yet I controlled for it. So we could not say that the optimism is just like religious, God will take care of it sort of thing, that it was more to it than that. Although I think, as I mentioned, there are these unobservable things about religion that do contribute to optimism and resilience. And then I wanted to get at evangelicals, because there are a lot of low-income whites in the evangelical community, and it's a religion that emphasizes people's individual relationship with God much more than these more communal religions. And I thought that might come in there as an explanation, but we just couldn't get good enough sort of fine-grained religious data. So what I can say is I know it's important. There's some unobservables surrounding it that seem to matter, but our findings are not driven by religion.
Yeah. Okay, so another question is, what are your thoughts regarding the role of media, and maybe particularly social media, on how individuals report their level of optimism?
One of the concerns is always that there's bias in reporting. And maybe this is just a cultural thing. And we find cultural differences in the way people report their well-being across regions. So Latin Americans always score higher than their income would predict, and East Asians tend to score lower. Eastern Europeans tend to score lower. Americans are much more extreme in their responses. We're more likely to say we're very happy or very unhappy, versus Danes are much more likely to be in the middle. Their average tends to be higher than ours. But so one of the things I did, again, is try and just make sure that wasn't driving my findings to the extent you can. So what I found is that the same optimistic low-income African Americans reported their financial situation to be bad, the city they lived in to be a bad place, but they wanted to improve it. We've done some other work along these lines, sort of making sure it isn't just an overall kind of Pollyanna effect that could be different across races or cultures. And that is not indeed the case. And then when we found that optimism really mattered to outcomes, there seems to be more to it than cultural differences, but cultural differences affect, without a doubt, in the same way that your genes affect kind of how you go through life, that I think they affect is sort of the development of resilience. And maybe it's as simple as your willingness to reach out to somebody else if you're in need, right? And the other thing we find is that there's part of this resilience, whether it's good or bad, I don't know, but Blacks and Hispanics are much less likely to report suicides than are whites. There's more of a stigma. There's just a big cultural stigma against it. So I don't think that's big enough to change the numbers in the data in terms of actual suicides, but it may affect reports of anxiety or depression as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So it's 1 o'clock, but do you mind if I sneak in a question?
Yeah, and there was a comment about evangelicals that I just saw, that somebody that studied the community. So I'm curious for that one as well.
Oh, is this in the? I don't see that. Is this in
Might
the
be
chat?
in the chat.
No.
I think it just came up.
What to say?
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, as long as I have it, that's great. I was just curious. It's that last in the chat. It says,
yeah, if you want to go ahead and read, for some reason I'm not seeing it, but if you want to,
it's from Samantha, and it says, not necessarily a question, but I've done extensive research in the evangelical community and how it is based on Calvinistic doctrines. of predestination and the Protestant work ethic, and how it drives the concept of meritocracy, which is indeed what I was talking about. I think a deep dive into the more standalone strains of Christianity would be very interesting. Samantha, please do it.
Yeah, I mean, related to that, one thing, not on the outcomes that you're studying, but I remember seeing, a year or so ago, research on the difference between people who report being evangelical and people who but don't actually attend church frequently, and people who attend church services weekly. And there were some, it was focusing more on outcomes related to prejudice, voting behavior and things like that. And they did find differences between the people who both report being evangelical Christians, but one's very, very active in church, very socially connected, you might say, to a faith community, and the other is just kind of presumably at home doing their own thing, even though they see that as an identity. But one I guess, as a way to kind of combine a couple questions as a final question, and hopefully this will make sense, is when you were talking about the labor market changes, particularly related to working class males in manufacturing, I mean, we see this rise of populism, of course, both on the far right and the far left. And on the one hand, you see people really looking backwards, I would say, and saying, is there a way to recapture the past? And but not necessarily looking. And of course, there's a lot of people say, well, that's not going to happen, but not really looking forward. Some of your policy suggestions you were hinting at seem to be more looking forward about mentorship, education, specific, maybe vocational programs. And I was just wondering if you had some more either policy thoughts or specific ideas on that. And also we had a comment in here about other possibilities like universal basic income experiments and things like that. So just you wondering if, as a way to close out, if you wanted to speak to like a way forward in terms of, this is the Progressing and Flourishing workshop. So we try to end on a positive note with what are some positive ways forward that you think we could plug more people in to be contributing members of society and to improve their well-being.
So there's a couple of responses. One is there's a lot of neuroscience evidence on kind of despair and isolation and radicalization, which would go with the kind of the non-church going types profile, maybe a little bit more, but that people are much more vulnerable to conspiracy theories. And then I would say the opposite, the mirror of that, is that people without hope who don't have a narrative for the future are much more likely to look back, right? And unfortunately, they're looking back to a past we can't recreate because technology-driven growth is here to stay. It's like tectonic shifts in the earth. We can't turn back. And I do think social media has both played a negative role in driving some of those radicalization and theories, conspiracy theories. And then, you could go on social media for a long time. It makes people more aware of inequality and other stuff. And it also just spreads a lot of, it's not peer reviewed. There's no way of knowing what's really a scientific fact versus something somebody just put out there. And all of that, I think, is very negative in a context where people who don't have a path forward, are very vulnerable to, the kind of, I don't want to say it's so what, but, if you're in desperation, you're more likely to grab onto straws. I think that there's so many different ideas. I do think we have to make trade-offs because of resources and possibilities. For older workers out of the labor force, I think some of the very simple well-being interventions we have, such as getting people out of isolation and getting them to get active in their communities, volunteering, going on group walks, providing new opportunities to participate in the arts, whatever it might be that fits the community. I mean, these things you need to know the local context. To just get them out of isolation is probably what you can do. A lot of these people are in disability and they can't even look for jobs if they wanted to, but there tends to be this vicious downward cycle of pain, disability, out of the labor force, drugs. So that, and then there are obviously mental health approaches and strategies for dealing with drug issues. But I do think we need to think about the younger generation, because if they don't tool up for the skills that they need for tomorrow's labor markets, they're not going to have a future. And that, to me, it's not just a typical economist, calculation of life years, although that does, certainly that should be part of the calculation. I'm more worried that an 18-year-old is going to be in despair his or her whole life than a 60-year-old. Not that I'm not worried about all of them, but just in terms of policy. And that requires imparting the kind of knowledge I was talking about in mentorship. It shouldn't be a trade-off between you finish high school or you go to college. It's not clear. I mean, and there's some kind of college degrees that aren't very useful into tomorrow's labor markets, unless you then go on to grad school. And then you start talking about a very big ask, right? Of people that are starting off in difficult circumstances. There's lots of trainings that they can pursue. There are comeback towns in the heartland that are based on simply having medium tech programming skills as Silicon Valley invests in these places. The comeback towns tend to have a couple of things. They tend to have at least a community college, which is a great start for low-income kids. A lot of them do go on to college, but even if not, if they take certain medium tech kind of skills, they could get good jobs in this new sector where Silicon Valley is investing in the heartland rather than outsourcing abroad as much as they were. It requires decent infrastructure, decent public education, and it provides giving kids the information they need to know what's out there. They don't even know what choices they have, or if there are any choices. And that, to me, is huge. And it would, if we think about our society's health, productivity, and everything, if our next generation isn't trained for what's next, we're toast. Yes, of course, at the very high skills levels, we've got so much going on. But this is a lot of our society. And so I think really thinking hard on the kinds of programs that require, psychological knowledge, that require knowledge about where labor markets are going, that require support for kids who are, falling behind, in part because their parents don't have hope. They don't have hope. I work with the Maryland Behavioral Health Administration team in Maryland has a child and adolescent resiliency program. And they describe, sorry, that's a dog, obviously. They describe kids at 3 and 4 coming into preschool. They're children of opioid addicts and they're in stress at that age. What are their lives going to be like, right? So I just think we need to think about this crisis, not just in terms of the people who are dying, which is a tragedy on its own, but the people that are left behind. And I think, as you said, you're trained in psychology. We need people like you. I mean, I'm just a dumb economist that's benefited from working with psychologists, but it does require a very different focus. And that, yes, opportunity, moving to opportunity works in some cases, but there's a big selection bias about who moves, right? Who has the wherewithal to move, and also where companies invest. They tend to skim the top of the cream, and they'll invest in communities that really weren't that desperate anyway. So we're still left with a lot of left behinds, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That's a good note to end on. You've given us lots to think about and talk about here at India Shoot, and we very much appreciate you sharing your work with us.
Well, thank you for having me and for the great questions. And, if anybody wants to follow up, you all know how to reach me if people have questions that weren't answered or comments. And if that religious study gets done, Rebecca, whoever you are, please send it to me.
Yeah, you might have inspired a number of our students to start new projects. So thank you.
That's great.
And thanks again for your time.
Thanks for having me.